Hello and welcome to our ongoing series of compliance webinars presented by Mango. My name's Craig Thornton and I'm one of the owners here at Mango. This webinar finds me in South Africa where I'm meeting with our Mango partner and meeting with our Mango customers. Our panelist today is Nicholas Graham. Nicholas has a vast knowledge of quality, risk, health and safety and compliance. Nicholas is the Managing Director of SRM, a multinational South African consulting company. So welcome, Nicholas, and on with your presentation.
Okay, so first let's start off with the purpose. Well, the purpose of the webinar is to highlight the differences between the current OHSAS 18001-2007 standard and the soon-to-be released ISO 45001 standard. So for many of you who don't already know, there is an expectation, it's even on the ISO website, that the ISO 45000 standard is due to be released on the 12th of March 2018. So we're looking at just under 2 weeks, so 10 days time, we will have a published copy of the standard. So in terms of the objective of the webinar, I'd really like to equip listeners with some simple tools in order to be able to address the gaps between the two standards and to transition effectively, and also to highlight some of the pitfalls we have been experiencing with companies in South Africa and companies that I audit in Africa in terms of the effective implementation of OHSAS 18001 and how those issues could continue if not carefully considered with your transition to 45,000. And there are some issues, or there are some criteria in the 18,000 standard which are amplified in the 45,000 standard. And I think if we're having challenges in terms of the implementation of 18 currently, organizations carefully need to consider their transition. So the new ISO 45001 standard will replace the OHSAS 18001 standard, and as I said, it's due out on the 12th of March. Now, for those of you who are currently OHSAS 18000 certified, there will be a 3-year transition period, so you don't have to rush this. Now, we've already written our ISO 45001 standard. We're ready to go, and we've already engaged with our certification body. So we're hoping to be one of the first consulting companies in South Africa, and if not Africa, to achieve ISO 45001 status. So we've already written the standard. But for those of you who are 18,000 certified already, there's a 3-year transition period. So it's up to you if you want to transition quicker, or you can wait the 3-year period. So one of the important things that I think we need to engage on is what was the intended outcome of OHSAS 18001, and what is the intended outcome of the ISO 45001 standard? And a lot of those can be considered in your OSH policy. So 45,000, in many cases, I wouldn't say there's anything missing from the 18,000 standard, but there is more added to the 18,000 standard, which makes up ISO 45,000. So the intended outcome of your health and safety management system, if you use ISO 45001 as the standard to certify against, the focus is the elimination of hazards and the reduction of risk. Also, the continual improvement of your OSH performance. The fulfillment, now this is quite an interesting aspect, is that the ISO 45001 the ISO 14001-2015 standard refers to compliance obligations in their standard. Now, I've had a look at the FDIS, which is the final draft of the standard, and the standard as it is right now still refers to legal and other requirements. So I'll be quite interested to see when the final standard is published on the 12th of March, whether they're going to move over to the term compliance obligations or whether they're going to leave it as legal and other requirements. And I have to say, my personal preference would be to use the term compliance obligations, because I think it really encapsulates everything that legal and other requirements is trying to create. Now, obviously, one of the intended outcomes of the standard is to achieve your OSH objectives. Now, one of the things I would like to stress here, and that I'm going to emphasize it again and again as we go through the presentation, consultation and participation with the workforce or employee representatives is an intended outcome. An effective consultation. Now, I'm going to stress this now, is that as an auditor, I've continually come across challenges of organizations that have implemented OHSAS 18001 in South Africa, and I can understand with some of the history around labor relations with management, etc. I have seen across a lot of organizations where management is reluctant to get employee or employee representatives involved in the setting of objectives and policies and targets and a variety of different things at a high level. So now the challenge that I'm throwing out there to a lot of the South African and African companies is if it was a challenge under the current OHSAS 18001-2007 standard, it is amplified in the ISO 45001 standard. There is a very, very strong emphasis on consultation and participation with workforce or their representatives around objectives and policies and hazards and risks. And to be objective, that's already stated in our legal framework. So there always has been that emphasis, but I've noticed a reluctance with senior management to engage with the workforce around the setting of objectives and targets. So I'm just throwing that caveat out there as we stand right now. So one of the reasons that you'll understand for the delay, if you have a look at the ISO 9001 standard and ISO 14001, the previous versions was ISO 9001-2008, ISO 14001-2004, and the reason that it took so long for the updates of those particular standards is that they decided to set a common framework, and after they developed a common framework, and the common framework, by the way, was called the HLS, the high-level structure. So once they had finalized and agreed on the high-level structure, they were then free to review all of the existing standards and use the new HLS as a common framework for all of the ISO standards. So ISO 45001 is nevertheless similar to those standards and is built on top of the HLS. So I just wanted to take you through. There have obviously been some changes from the clause numbering between OHSAS 18001 and ISO 45000. New to the health and safety management system, but common to the HLS, is clause 4, which is the context of the organization. So here's where some of the new gaps are going to be identified between your current 18,000 system and 45,000. So clause 4 looks at the context of the organization, understanding the organization in its context, understanding the needs and expectations of interested and affected parties and workers, determining the scope of the OSH management system, and then clause 4.4, the actual OSH management system. So although if you had done an effective risk assessment in your 18,000 system, you would have, to a greater or lesser extent, already considered many of these variables, but they are now emphasized in the current 45,001 standard. Clause 5, as we move over, is going to deal with leadership and worker participation. So clause 5.1 is leadership commitment. Now, we all know that without leadership commitment, the level of effective OSH compliance and OSH culture implementation is going to be limited. So there's a very, very strong emphasis around leadership commitment, and even the reference of culture is brought into the 45,000 standard and guideline, the requirement to create an effective compliance culture within your organization. Also, 5.2 will deal with the OSH policy, and there are some differences between the 18,000 requirements and the 45,000 requirements with regards to commitments that you are required to make in your health and safety policy. 5.3 deals with organizational roles and responsibilities and authorities. And then I'm going to throw this out. 5.4, within leadership, consultation and participation of workers falls into clause 5.4. But I have to say, if I was going to develop an integrated system with 9 and 14, I would probably move clause 5.4 and I would incorporate it with clause 7.4 of support, which is communication. So I'd combine communication, consultation, and participation probably into one clause, and I wouldn't place it in clause 5. If I move on and look at clause 6, which is planning, there are obviously a lot of existing requirements from 18,000 that have been brought through here in terms of hazard identification and risk assessment, but one of the new requirements that we're looking at here, or an extension of the risk assessment where they brought greater emphasis, is going to be around clause 6.1.1, which is the strategic high-level risk and opportunities assessment. Okay, the determination of legal requirements and other requirements. Personally, again, as I said, I hope that they change that to the determination of compliance obligations. Again, that's just my personal leaning towards some terminology that incorporates what we're trying to achieve. And then 6.1.4, planning. 6.2 is your objectives and planning to achieve them. And then also unpacking 6.2 is going to look at objectives and the plan around that. Okay. If we move through to clause 7, which is support, Clause 7.1, we're going to be dealing with your resources, which is your entire component of resources for your organization, which is your human resources and infrastructure resources, obviously relevant to health and safety. 7.2 is going to be dealing with your competence requirements for your employees and contractors, etc. Awareness, 7.3. 7.4 is communication. Now, as I said when we got to clause 5, I personally, when I integrate standards, I would move the clause 5.4 requirements on communication and on consultation and participation. I would incorporate them into this clause of 7.4. So my 7.4 clause would be communication, consultation, and participation as an integrated approach. Also 7.5, for any of you who haven't been dealing with the new ISO 9001 or 14001 standards, previously there used to be a clause requirement for document control and then a separate clause requirement for record control. Now it's all combined into one clause named documented information. Okay, moving on to clause 8, which is operations. Here we've got general clauses. Here there's a focus on eliminating hazards and reducing risks. And here they talk about the hierarchy of risk control. Now, my personal approach to approaching clause 8.1.2 would be to combine that with clause 6.1.2, the risk assessment clause, and how I would approach the risk assessment and how I would approach the hierarchy of controls. I might combine 8.1.2 into clause 6.1.2. And also here are some of the new adds into the standard. There's a management of change, and there is a focus on the procurement. So we could look at the procurement of materials and people, and also there's an emphasis on outsourcing. So obviously we know within South Africa there is a huge component of outsourcing, and I'm very appreciative of the fact that a greater emphasis has been brought into the controls that are going to be placed on companies that perform outsourcing within their organization. So moving on to clause 9, we deal with the evaluation of the system. So in essence, we've moved through or have been moving through the plan, do, check, act approach. So here we're at the checking phase when we deal with clause 9, performance evaluation. We're looking at monitoring, measuring, analysis, and performance evaluation. We look at some general requirements. We look at the evaluation of compliance, we look at the internal audit program, and we also deal with management review as the checking components of the effectiveness of your OSH management system and the effectiveness of your controls. Then last but not least is clause 10, which will deal with improvements, and here is where we deal with the incident, non-conformity, and corrective action. Now, somebody may have already had an alarm bell saying, hey, where's preventive action? Now, one of the things I'd like you to pay attention to here is the fact that the approach of risk-based thinking has been applied to the new HLS and applied to a lot of the ISO standards. So preventive action as such has not been removed, but when we apply our risk-based thinking and our approach to the identification of hazards and risks, that preventive action has been accommodated within that particular ambit of the standard. And then obviously at the end, we have got our continual improvement. So that was just an overview of the ISO 45001 standard and what you can expect. So what's new and what's different between ISO 45001 and compared to OHSAS 18001? Now again, just emphasizing the fact that the new ISO 45001 standard is based on the high level structure. In the new standard, there is a greater focus on the environment in which the organization operates, as well as a greater role assigned to top management. Now, I'll emphasize that when we get into understanding the clauses, particularly around clause 4, which is the imperative of the organization to understand the environment within which it operates and what health and safety hazards and risks are created within that environment. And that extends outside the gate of your organization as well. Is who are your neighbors? What is the infrastructure around you? Do you have high voltage electricity cables adjacent to your factory? Could there be a collapse? Could there something adjacent to your factory impact the health and safety of your operations? So let's have a look at what's new and what's different. Okay, there's going to be easier integration with other standards. And personally, because I've been involved in system integration for quite some time, I'm really appreciative of the fact that the high-level structure has been developed, because previously, in my mind, ISO 9001 was the red-headed stepchild that had its own particular framework of how it was developed. ISO 14001-2004 could be integrated quite easily with OHSAS 18001 because there were similar clause requirements, but there was some careful or fancy footwork that had to be done with integrating 14 and 18 with 9. Now enter the HLS structure, and now we have a lot easier integration. There is also a greater focus on the process-based approach to the development of the system. The same commitments in OHSAS 18001 also apply to regulatory compliance. So there is still that emphasis on the fact that the organization should meet their legal and other requirements. There is also a great emphasis, and I celebrate this, is the emphasis on leadership and culture. As for anybody who's been involved in the development and implementation of systems within organizations, there's a saying that I've heard on some TED Talks. It says that culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. And the beautiful thing about management systems is it creates a structure and a strategy for the organization. But we all know that if there is a negative culture within the organization, that's going to eat your strategy for breakfast every day. So there's a great emphasis around leadership and making sure that you don't just have a good structure and strategy through your OSH management system, but you're also working on the behavior of the individuals, the thought patterns that influence the behavior that we have, the unwritten rules that we have within organizations. There's also greater flexibility around documentation. So previously within a lot of standards, there would have been a lot of mandatory documents that you used to have. So the new ISO 45000 meeting with the previous ISO standards of 9 and 14 has introduced greater document flexibility. There's also greater importance on the hierarchy of control, from elimination, substitution, engineering, administrative, all the way down to PPE, and how you apply the hierarchy of controls to the management of your hazards and risks. There is a very proactive strategic approach as well within the ISO 45001 standard. ISO 45001 focuses on identifying and controlling risks rather than hazards, as was required in the OHSAS 18001 standard. Some of the terminology will use similar approaches of other management systems while also maintaining a different specialized approach on OSH management system requirements. So risk-based thinking is one of the major changes in ISO 45001 compared to OHSAS 18001. Now, obviously, with the health and safety management system, all of you will be aware of the fact that we all had to apply our mind to health and safety hazards and risks. But the emphasis here is on there's a greater emphasis on the strategic high-level risk assessment approach. And a better focus on stakeholders is another change in ISO 45001. Okay, so new requirements in detail. Let's actually have a look at some of the more significant changes. So clause 4.1 and 4.2, understanding your organization and its context, and understanding the needs and expectations of workers and interested and affected parties. These are both new adds to the ISO 45001 system, and we'll unpack that in detail, and I'll show you some of the tools that we've been using successfully with clients to take them through to certification against the new 9001 and 14001 standards. So also 6.1.1, risk and opportunities. Although this is not a new addition to the standard, there's greater emphasis on expanded approach on considering strategic high-level risks and opportunities to the organization. 8.1.2, which is the hierarchy of controls. There's some new emphasis placed on that. As I said previously, I would probably integrate 8.1.2 with 6.1.2 in terms of my understanding of my approach to identifying hazards and risks and how I would apply the hierarchy of controls to managing those hazards and risks. 8.2, management of change. There obviously was emphasis created for the management of change in the 18001 standard. Obviously now that has its own particular clause. 8.3, outsourcing, procurement, and contractors. So it's not 8.3, it's a caveat of 8.2. Outsourcing, procurement, and contractors are all brought into those particular requirements in 45,000. Okay, so let's have a look at clause 4 and also the clause 6 relationship. So I've put together a little process map there that can help people to understand. With clause 4.1, you're required to understand the organization and its context. So in short, who are we, where are we, and what do we do? Before we could even hope to perform an effective risk assessment, we have to have a planning and discovery requirement built into the standard. Because I can't do a risk assessment if I don't know who I am, where I am, what equipment, what chemicals, what are my activities, products, services, substances, materials, plant, equipment, etc. I need to define that, who we are, etc. Also, 4.2, understanding the needs and expectations of interested and affected parties is obviously a key caveat. Who are the people that have a vested interest in the health and safety, performance and compliance of my company? Well, my neighbors. What about the communities that surround my organization? All of these are interested and affected parties who have needs and expectations with regards to your health and safety compliance. And we need to identify them up front. And I have to say to the ladies and gents that develop the standard, I really have to appreciate this approach of applying your mind to your context and what you need to consider before you start developing your system. So that's clause 4.1 and 4.2. So those two are considered when you determine the scope. So the little gray box that I've drawn there, you use clause 4.1 and 4.2 as contextual understanding when defining the scope of your organization. Now here is where we may have some hot debate on this particular topic, but I'm going to throw it out there, is as an auditor, I was quite saddened when I audited some organizations to see that they had limited the scope of the health and safety management system just to the head office. And I'll use a construction company as an example for that. Construction companies, there were several of them that I was aware of that had limited the scope of the health and safety management system to just the head office. So that when they submitted their certificates for tender processes, etc., people would think, oh, these companies are certified against OHSAS 18001, but obviously didn't read the fine print on the certificate. Now, within the guideline of ISO 45001, it does allow you to be flexible in terms of the determination of your scope. However, as an auditor, I would like to throw this out to anybody who's listening and say, one of the requirements of the standard in clause 4 that says when you determine the scope of your system, you need to consider clause 4.1 and 4.2, the needs and expectations of the interested and affected parties. When you determine your scope, you need to consider, you obviously want to extend the scope of your system to manage your health and safety hazards and risks. So I have to say that I think as an auditor, I'd be quite uncomfortable with an organization that has limited the scope of the health and safety management system to just the head office. Because then I would question them and say, well, your customers who are dealing with you, so somebody's commissioned you to build a building, do you think they want the scope of your health and safety management system to be extended to include your on-site operations? Because I would quite comfortably be able to say to them that your customers' expectations is that your hazards and risks are managed at your manufacturing plants and construction sites where the bulk of your health and safety hazards and risks are. So that's my personal opinion, and I'm just throwing it out there. We may just get some questions that are thrown in by any of the people who are listening to the webinar at the moment. So clause 4.3 is determine the scope of your system. As you can see, we've ring-fenced it there. And then clause 4.4 is your health and safety management system with your inputs and outputs. Now, clause 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, and 4.4 all need to be considered with your strategic risk assessment at 611. So moving on, let's have a look at clause 4.2 in detail. The context of the organization is a new concept compared with 18,001. We need to consider our internal issues and our external issues. So internal issues which the organization needs to consider. So the structure, what are your responsibilities? What is the distribution of people within the organization or across all the sites? What is personal knowledge? What is the level of middle management? What is the level of technology that you have within your organization? Do you use software to manage your OSH management system, or do you still use paper? What is the information flow? What is the processes and decision making within your organization? Those are the internal context of your organization. That's the internal context of your organization that you need to consider. What about external issues? So what is the culture of your organization? What is the environment? What is the culture of your organization? Is it production at all costs? So we've got to build the building at all costs. So you may have the Rolls-Royce of documented health and safety management systems, but again, your prevailing culture could frustrate that with regards to management and supervisors overruling people and saying that they've got to get things done. So some of the external issues, also new technology, new legislation, your neighbors, your suppliers are all external issues that you need to consider when determining the scope and the complexity of your management system. The above must be considered when determining the scope, as I've said, and I always see clause 4.1 and 4.2 as adding incredible value when I need to perform the clause 6.1.1 strategic risk and opportunities assessment. So, as I said previously, having taken numerous clients through certification against ISO 9001:2015 and 14001:2015, we've already applied the clause 4.1 requirements to those clients and developed some tools around how to do that. So what I wanted to do now is to show you some of the tools that we've deployed. Now, one of the tools that we use is a tool called Discovery. When we first start developing a management system, we have an extensive discovery tool. So I asked the client, I said, can I have a look at your site plans? I take aerial photographs of their sites and I have a look at whether they have streams or rivers or high voltage power lines, or is your food manufacturing plant next to a major hazardous installation or a chemical manufacturing plant? You need to obviously consider your neighbors. I start looking at shift patterns. Are you working during the day? Are you working at nighttime? Because now we know that the Basic Conditions of Employment Act within South Africa requires that once you work at night, you need a night risk assessment. So here are all of those internal and external context issues that, if you do a comprehensive discovery, will allow you to effectively develop your health and safety management system. We look at their processes, we look at their facilities, we look at some of their non-routine activities that would occur, breakdowns, etc. We have a look at what some of their workplace environmental stresses could be, noise, ventilation, ergonomics, vibration, radiation, etc. We declare that with the client up front in our discovery tool. We also have a look at what their plant and equipment are, because as you'll know, when you develop a system, each one of those pieces of plant and equipment that we've listed in this tool all attract legal requirements. And the beauty of the law, the legal framework that we have, particularly in South Africa, and I would assume for the rest of the world, is that for each one of those particular pieces of equipment that I've listed, there is a legal requirement that would define, in many cases, what control hierarchies you need to apply to that particular piece of equipment, whether it's a pressure release valve and periodic inspections and competency requirements around the use of that particular piece of tool and equipment will be defined in the law. So it's always a good idea up front to have an understanding of the tools, plant, equipment, etc., that the company utilize. We have a look at gardening activities because, funnily enough, I see that fall off a lot of risk assessments. So you could have a chainsaw and some lawnmowers and brush cutters and weed eaters and all those kind of pieces of tools and equipment which regularly don't find themselves onto risk assessments. So it's looking at some of those not non-routine activities, but those kind of softer activities as such. We also have a look at the current understanding. We have a look at a list of substances. We ask the client to provide us with all the material safety data sheets. We have a look at all the previous near misses and first aid cases. We have a look at potential emergencies. We have a look at the types of contractors that they'll be working with, because each individual contractor is going to introduce different risks. I'll give you an example there is a pest control contractor. Now, I know from South African law that if I've got a pest control contractor, they've got to have a pest control applicator's license. There's going to be pesticides on my site. There's going to be bait stations. All of those need to be considered. So I'm trusting that you can see within this tool that we've developed that if you effectively do discovery for your organization, it helps you to establish the internal and external context for your management system. So from there, we then have developed a little tool called 4.4.1 Understanding of the Organization and its Context, where we identify what are the issues affecting organizations, affecting our organization that we want to develop the system for. Is it an internal or external issue? Now I'm going through the columns from left to right. We first identify the issue affecting the organization. We then state whether that particular issue is internal or external of the organization. We then define whether it affects safety, health, environmental quality, or either individually or a combination thereof. And then say, well, how does that particular issue that we've identified, how does it affect the intended outcome? Now, remember, from the beginning of the conversation, I said, well, the intended outcome is to prevent injury and ill health. The intended outcome of your management system is to manage, mitigate, or eliminate hazards and risks. It's to ensure legal compliance. So once we've identified the issue affecting the organization, we determine how that particular issue could affect the intended outcome of the management system. Then in the last column, we then say, well, how can we then leverage this tool of the management system that we're about to develop to manage, mitigate, substitute, or eliminate that particular issue? So what we're doing is this is a planning tool to say these are the issues, that's how it can affect us, how can we best leverage our system to manage those internal and external issues. So that's a tool that we use for clause 4.1. Then we have clause 4.2. The needs and expectations of workers and interested and affected parties. So this is something that I really like because it forces organizations to look outside of the gate. A lot of risk assessments that I have a look at from an auditing perspective focus primarily on activities, products, services, substances, materials, plant and equipment internal of the gate, which are performed by the organization. But as I said earlier, you may be adjacent to a chemical manufacturing company or adjacent to a river that could flood, and those are all issues that are external of your gate that could affect health and safety for your employees, visitors, or contractors on your site. So again, we've developed a little tool called the 4.4.2 Needs of Interested and Affected Parties. Now, one of the things that's created within the standard is the requirement to identify the needs and expectations of interested and affected parties and then state whether you're going to consider those as a compliance obligation. So what we've done in this particular sheet is to identify who are our interested parties, workers, etc., and then to say, well, what are they interested in? Safety, health, environmental equality, and then to define what the need or expectation, and as I'm trusting you can see by the example that these are at a very macro level. What are the requirements of the interested and affected party? And then what we state after that is, are we then going to consider that need and expectation as a compliance obligation in our system? So yes or no. So let's say, as an example, the Department of Labor is an interested and affected party. Yes, they have a vested interest in my company. They want to ensure that we comply with the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulations. So are we then going to consider that need and expectation as a compliance obligation? Definitively, yes. So that means that we'll obviously have our legal register. We would then perform an evaluation of compliance, which will be built into our auditing process. And that will then be able to demonstrate how we have met the need and expectation of that interested and affected party. Because remember that the Department of Labor represent the people of South Africa or South African Pty Limited. So that's just a tool that we use for determining the requirements of clause 4.4. Now, one of the expansion opportunities is clause 6.1.1, which is the requirement to identify risks and opportunities. So if you have a look at the clause when it comes out, you'll see that it says that after considering your internal and external context, and after considering the needs and expectations of interested and affected parties, the organization should identify risks and opportunities. So what I've done here is I have created a little risk assessment sheet you can see where we have identified internal and external issues at a macro level. We've identified how that could affect the organization. We have then quantified that assessment as saying, well, what is that risk to our organization? Now, to throw out a South African context is obviously over the past few years we have had utilities challenges. So the availability of power during working hours has been a challenge for us to date. So that would be a strategic risk that we want to consider and see how we could manage or mitigate that. So a lot of those issues would be accommodated at clause 6.1.1. Also, 8.1.2 identifies the need to address hazards and risks according to a hierarchy of controls. Now, as I've said earlier a couple of times, I would incorporate clause 8.1.2 probably into clause 6.1.2 because I consider the hierarchy of controls in my approach to risk assessment. So I've just given a very, very simplified approach of risk assessment. I've incorporated that diagram into this presentation slide so you can see how I've identified hazards and risks and how, when I look at my risk mitigation, I have then defined what my engineering controls or admin and PPE. Now, obviously, prior to this, or as an approach, we've already considered elimination or substitution a part of our risk assessment approach. So 8.1.2 now, hierarchy of controls, now has its own clause, but again, I would incorporate that into clause 6.1.2. Management of change. Now, if I have to say as an auditor, one of the places that I have raised the most amount of non-conformities against organizations is probably going to be against this particular issue, as I find particularly where accidents happen or where audit findings are raised and improvements and non-conformities are raised, very few organizations perform some form of risk understanding prior to the implementation of those changes. Now, that was still a requirement in 18001. It's now an emphasized requirement. It has its own clause in ISO 45001. So there is an imperative to create a process within your organization where change is carried out in a formalized, structured approach where there is an understanding of risks, hazards and risks, and a risk mitigation plan prior to the implementation of change within the organizations. I'll give an effective example here is regularly I will find that procurement in an organization procures a new chemical on behalf of the company. And regularly when we do a chemical inventory within an organization, we'll find chemicals within the store that procurement were aware about that have now come into the store. Operations knows nothing about it. There's no safety data sheet on the site. Nobody's considered that in a risk assessment or even knows what type of impact that particular chemical is going to have. So you can incorporate your change management process into your procurement process as well as a mechanism of identifying hazards and risks prior to the procurement of items for health and safety or production items, which could introduce additional hazards and risks to your organization. Now, moving on to another component of Clause 8, which will be your procurement process. We are now going to look at outsourcing and contractor management. And I just want to speak around those particular requirements, because if I had to put my finger on where a lot of organizations that I've worked with or audited don't have sufficient controls, I would say contractor control in a lot of South African companies is exposing organizations to a significant amount of risk, because organizations in most cases are well able to control the hazards and risks created by their own employees, but when contractors come onto their site, there is generally a significant level of poor management and a lot of risks that are created by contractors. So let's have a look at outsourcing. Outsourcing and labor brokers within the South African context is a massive issue. We all know that. Now, an example that I'll give here would be the construction industry. A lot of the construction industry will use labor brokers for some of the simple work that needs to be done. Plastering, brickwork, etc. may be done, and it's not necessarily a simple activity, but a lot of that may be outsourced to labor broking. Now, what the new standard brings a particular emphasis around here, that outsourcing processes shall be controlled and monitored. The organization, if they're going to certify against ISO 45001, needs to define those specific controls. Now, I'll give you an example of some of our clients that are logistics companies. They extensively use labor broking, and how they approach managing the labor broker's controls is that the labor broker that supplies employees to their companies, those employees will fall under their system. So even if you have a look at the Occupational Health and Safety Act, there are some requirements in there with regards to employees who are not under your control, and particularly around outsourcing. So my suggestion around here is that particularly if you're going to use outsourcing and labor brokers, that they don't provide their own health and safety documentation, that they fall under your system if it's a labor-only employed. Again, that's just a suggestion. I may not be privy to all of the details on your particular site, but that's something that we've considered based on our understanding of labor broking as it applies to a lot of our clients. So that's looking at outsourcing. Also, procurement. The organization is now required to implement effective controls when purchasing goods so they conform to the requirements of their OSH management system. Now, again, I use the example of chemicals. This is my particular bugbear when it comes to health and safety management systems and very, very poor, if not mediocre, controls around the management of chemicals. Now, if I had to apply a legal understanding to the procurement of goods, if we have a look at Section 10 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which is the sale of articles and substances for use in the workplace. If you're going to be supplying articles or substances for use in the workplace, you should be providing information on the safe use and operation of those tools and equipment, particularly around Section 10.4 agreements from the Occupational Health and Safety Act. If you are a recipient of goods or services around which could affect health and safety on your site, it's imperative that you understand how those products or how those services could affect your organization from a health and safety perspective. One of the regular things that I ask organizations when I audit them is I see particular machinery and equipment and I ask them, well, guys, do you have the product manual provided by the supplier? Because one of the best sources of information for your risk assessment when you're doing a risk assessment on a new machine that's been installed is the manual that's been provided by the service provider. That should be your first go-to point. And a lot of people never provide proper controls around controlling the product manuals of machinery and equipment that come into organizations. So again, just emphasizing this, it's got its own particular clause requirements for the controls around the procurement of products and services. And again, also an emphasis is brought to contractors. Again, from a South African context, there is a significant challenge around contractor management. Now, we all know that there is a Section 37.2 mandatories agreement that organizations can enter into with contractors. And I'd like to just emphasize here that when a contractor signs a Section 37.2 mandatories agreement, it is not the transfer of liability to the contractor. It's highlighting the relationship and saying, please understand that we see you as a mandatory. You are an employer in your own right. They would be responsible for providing their own safety documentation. Now, just think about this. If a contractor is going to install a boiler at your premises, they would be the subject matter experts around the installation and commissioning of the boiler. You may not know the first thing about boiler installation. So it stands to good reason that they would provide their own risk assessments and their own safety documentation for the installation and commissioning of that plant and equipment. However, they will still be walking through your premises and they will be exposed to hazards and risks on your site. So you need to be aware that the contractor provides documentation for their own activities, but you need to be aware of the hazards and risks that the contractor is going to introduce to your site and what health and safety risks you will expose the contractors to just by virtue of the fact that they're working on your premises. Those are some of the factors that you're going to have to consider in contractor control for ISO 45001. Now again, if you're thinking of transitioning to the ISO 45001 question, your big question is going to be around scope. I would throw it out there to say the intended outcome of your health and safety management system is to prevent injury and ill health. Therefore, when you determine the scope of your health and safety management system, make sure it extends to your activities, products, services, and substances, materials, plant and equipment, etc., where your employees could be hurt. Don't be one of those organizations that limits the scope to just their head office and sends their certificates in as part of the tender process. Also, one of the big questions to throw out in a South African context is around the greater significant emphasis around consultation and participation. And to be quite frank on this, I have to say about time. Guys, about time. There is no way that we can have an effective health and safety management system without worker consultation and participation. And if I have to throw some of the history around this as to why ISO never had an effective health and safety management system was because of America and the ILO not wanting to become a signatory on it, because they said, well, we've got our own internal standards. And if I had to, and from my understanding as to why there is a greater emphasis on consultation and participation, is because those type of organizations have got involved and said, we are not going to become a signatory on this standard unless there is a greater emphasis on worker consultation and participation. And with all due respect, at the end of the day, there is a massive emphasis within the South African legal framework around the consultation and participation of the workforce in issues that could affect their health and safety, in their objectives, in the setting of policies, in the identification of hazards and risks and controls. So it's already within the legal framework, and I'm just saying there is a greater expectation around this if you're transitioning to the ISO 45001 standard. So just in summary, I really celebrate the standard. I've had a look at it, I've read through it from start to finish, and obviously I have a lot of context from being involved in ISO 9001-2015 and 14001-2015. So I really celebrate the new emphasis around Clause 4 on identifying your context, on having some significant planning and discovery arrangements around identifying everything that you need to identify: who we are, where we are, what do we do, who are our neighbors, who are the communities surrounding us, who are the people that we could affect inside and outside of the gate. Consider all of those requirements when you're going to define the scope of your health and safety management system. All of those issues that you identify will be considered in your strategic risk and opportunities assessment, and there is a much greater emphasis brought around procurement, outsourcing, the procurement of products and services, and contractor management. So that brings me to the end of my presentation on the webinar, and we're going to open it up for questions. If anybody is out there and would like to ask some questions.
Thank you all for attending today's webinar. If you have any other questions, just forward them through, and between Nicholas and I will answer those. And have a great day. Thank you all.